There's an old saying that says there's no such thing as a free lunch. And it's often talked about how there's always something involved in it. Even if it seems like it's free, there's some sort of cost somewhere along the line. Someone's paying for it, or it's going to cost you in the end. And maybe that phrase is true, but for the crowd we're going to be looking at today, they may have thought there was such a thing as a free supper. Because that's one of the things we're going to be looking at today. We're going to be looking at one of the most famous of all of Jesus' miracles. We normally call it the feeding of the 5,000. And when we talk about the feeding of the 5,000, we're told that it's 5,000 men, and that doesn't include women and children. And so as we look at the second half of Mark 6 today, this is going to be the main part of it, is the feeding of the 5,000, the miracle, and the people's response to this miracle and what they expect out of as a result of this miracle. But to look at the feeding of the 5,000, we have to go back to the last few verses that we had looked at last week. Because when we're talking about the feeding of the 5,000, one of the things is that it starts with not the break that they wanted, not the break the disciples wanted. Mark 6, 30 through 32. The apostles gathered together with Jesus, and they reported to him all that they had done and taught. And he said to them, "Come away by yourselves to a secluded place and rest a while." For there were many people coming and going, and they did not even have time to eat. They went away in the boat to a secluded place by themselves. And so they'd just gotten back from mission trips, as it were, and from doing a lot of preaching and healing, and they want to go and they want to tell them about what's going on. And this is soon after the death of John the Baptist that we looked at. And it says that the crowds, there's so many people there that they did not even have time to eat. They didn't even have time to have a meal. So it says, let's go to another location. And it says that they decided to go to a secluded place by themselves. Sometimes people just need a break. They've had stuff going on and they just need time to rest, to calm down, to relax, to replenish themselves, to have some peace and quiet. But we don't always get that. And so they wanted a break, but it wasn't the break they wanted because people keep coming after them. And we see that Jesus has compassion. Verses 33 through the first part of 37. The people saw them going, and many recognized them and ran there together on foot from all the cities and got there ahead of them. When Jesus went ashore, he saw a large crowd, and he felt compassion for them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. And he began to teach them many things. When it was already quite late, his disciples came to him and said, "This place is desolate, and it is already quite late. Send them away so that they may go into the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But he answered them, "You give them something to eat." He had compassion on them. He sees them, even though he wants a rest, even though his disciples want to rest. He sees these people that have flocked. He has compassion on them, and he starts teaching them. It says, because they were like sheep without a shepherd. It reminds me of Matthew 9:36. Seeing the people, he felt compassion for them because they were distressed and dispirited like sheep without a shepherd. When Jesus saw these people, he recognized them as wandering off, as not knowing who to follow. He has compassion on them because they need a shepherd in their lives. Today, a common insult for people is talking about how they're sheep, how they just blindly follow along with one leader or another. Both political parties accuse most of the people that vote for their opponents as being sheep that aren't aware of what's going on. And the fact is that most people in America are sheep without a shepherd. They're following after one person or another person, but if those people aren't leading them to God, they're just lost. And so many are dispirited. And they need a shepherd. And Jesus saw them and he had compassion on them. And he teaches them and it gets quite late. And the disciples are like, yeah, send them away to eat. And he says, you give them something to eat. There's a large crowd here, and the disciples are like, man, this is the middle of nowhere. We went to the middle of nowhere because we thought no one would follow us. And now all these people are here, and it's late, and they need food. Now, if you remember just a few verses sooner, it said they did not even have time to eat. So we don't know for sure, but the disciples might still have not eaten themselves. They're like, send everyone away. And they're also probably thinking, we need to go get something to eat. Even if they had eaten on the way over, several hours have passed and everyone's hungry again. And this isn't a place where you can find a lot of food. And the disciples want them to go away. It's not exactly that they don't have compassion. It's just they don't have a way in their minds to do anything about the problem. So they say, send them where they can get food. But Jesus has even more compassion. He says, we need to do something about this. And we see an incredible miracle take place. Mark 6, starting in verse 37 and going to verse 44. But he answered them, you give them something to eat. And they said to him, shall we go and spend 200 denarii on bread and give them something to eat? And he said to them, how many loaves do you have? Go look. And when they found out, they said, 5 and 2 fish. And he commanded them all to sit down by groups on the green grass. They sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties. And he took the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up toward heaven, he blessed the food and broke the loaves. And he kept giving them to the disciples to set before them. And he divided up the 2 fish among them all. They all ate and were satisfied. And they picked up 12 full baskets of the broken pieces, and also the fish. There were 5,000 men who ate the loaves. And so we see here that when he tells them, you give them something to eat, they say, shall we go and spend 200 denarii? A denarii was about a day's wages. This is more than half a year's wages. This is about 7 months. It's about 7 months' wages almost. And they say it's not enough. One of the Gospels talks about how it would only be enough to give each person a little. And yet Jesus is undeterred. And he asks them how many loaves they have. Go look. Now, this one doesn't record it. John is the only one that gives us information about where the bread and the fish came from. John 6, verses 8 and 9. It says, one of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, said to him, there's a lad here who has 5 barley loaves and 2 fish. But what are these for so many people? And the thing is that, this boy seems to bring forward his food for them. He brings it forward and says, you can use my food. And apparently the barley loaves, my dad was talking about this not long ago, the barley loaves were the loaves that you made when you didn't have as much. And so this was a poor boy And yet he's still willing to give his bread and his fish, his food for everyone. And even though it's just a little bit, and even though Andrew says, and what could this little bit do? Jesus does an incredible miracle. And he feeds 5,000 men along with women and children. And it's estimated that probably around 15,000, maybe more. And at minimum, about 10,000 people were fed. And that's an incredible amount of people to be fed with such a little bit. It would have taken hours to break it and distribute it to all the people, and yet they do that. It's already late at this time, and yet Jesus breaks it apart and distributes it and lets everyone eat until they are satisfied. And they picked up 12 full baskets of the broken pieces and also of the fish. There was more than enough food to go around. An incredible miracle. And after this miracle, we see that Jesus walks on water. Now, the feeding of the 5,000 is the only miracle outside of the resurrection of Christ that is recorded in all four Gospels. The walking on the water is only in 3 of the Gospels. But we see that Jesus sends the disciples ahead. Mark 6:45. Immediately, Jesus made his disciples get into the boat and go ahead of him to the other side to Bethsaida, while he himself was sending the crowd away. And so he tells them, he says, you need to go ahead. You need to go forward. I'll catch up to you. Now, they don't know how he's going to catch up, but he tells them that he will meet them or catch up to them somehow and sends them on ahead. And the reason he does that is because he knows what's going on. And we see that Jesus escapes the crowd. Mark 6:46 through 49. After bidding them farewell, he left for the mountain to pray. When it was evening, the boat was in the middle of the sea, and he was alone on the land. Seeing them straining again at the oars, for the wind was against them, at about the 4th watch of the night, he came to them, walking on the sea, and he intended to pass by them. And so we see Mark talks about he dismisses them, he goes up to a mountain to pray, and then he walks on the water. But John, again, gives us a little glimpse into why this happened. John 6, verse 15, it says, So Jesus, perceiving that they were intending to come and take him by force to make him king, withdrew again to the mountain by himself alone. And so he recognizes that they're getting ready to make him king by force after this miracle. And so he tells them to be dismissed, and apparently they kind of linger around, and he goes up, there's a mountain nearby, and he goes up to the mountain to pray, and they probably assume that he can't escape, that the disciples have already left, so they don't need to worry about trying to prevent the boat from leaving. Which is probably why he sent the disciples ahead. If he had not sent the disciples ahead, they may have been trying to watch that boat to make sure it didn't leave if Jesus was with his disciples, because they wanted to do it by force. But by sending them ahead, it allowed him to escape the crowd, because they had a different idea in mind as a response. And we see that the disciples lack understanding. Mark 6:49 through 52. But when they saw him walking on the sea, they cried out. They supposed that it was a ghost and cried out, for they all saw him and were terrified. But immediately he spoke with them and said to them, Take courage, it is I, do not be afraid. Then he got into the boat with them, and the wind stopped, and they were utterly astonished. For they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. What a sad statement about the apostles. They had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, for their heart was hardened. They don't understand. John 6:21 again adds a little bit more information. It says, So they were willing to receive him into the boat, and immediately the boat was at the land to which they were going. Not only does he calm the storm that they're dealing with, but they immediately go from struggling in the middle of a storm to at the land. And again, this all happens late at night. It talks about it happening at the fourth watch of the night. In verse 48, it says the fourth watch of the night. That's between 3 and 6 a.m. So it was evening when he does the miracle, and then it's already night when they get in the boat. It's very early in the morning at this point in time. But they arrive at their destination. But we see that a crowd immediately gathers. And a crowd immediately gathers because word quickly spreads. Mark 6:53 through 55. When they crossed over, they came to land at Gennesaret and moored to the shore. When they got out of the boat, immediately the people recognized him and ran about that whole country and began to carry here and there on their pallets those who were sick to the place they heard he was. And so we see they get there between 3 and 6 a.m. And there are people that recognize him immediately. Maybe some fishermen that had been out in the night or something. But they immediately start gathering people. And Mark 6:24 and 25 says, So when the crowd saw that Jesus was not there, nor his disciples, they themselves got into the small boats and came to Capernaum seeking Jesus. When they found him on the other side of the sea, they said to him, Rabbi, when did you get here? So a crowd sees him, and the crowd that had been there, some of those go to seek him out as well. And more healings take place. Verse 56, whenever he entered villages or cities or countryside, they were laying the sick in the marketplaces and imploring him that they might just touch the fringe of his cloak. And as many as touched it were being cured. And so they want to just touch him. And so there are many that are still believing in him. Many are looking for him. And so many healings take place. But we also see that Jesus loses many disciples. But Jesus also loses many disciples. And this isn't recorded in Mark, but we see this in John. When they find him, Jesus starts teaching them about the difference between the physical bread and the physical food that they'd received and the spiritual bread. And he talks about himself being the bread of life and that they need to eat him. That they have to eat the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood. And verse 60, it says, Therefore many of his disciples, when they heard this, said, This is a difficult statement. Who can listen to it? And then skipping down to verse 36, it says, As a result of this, many of his disciples withdrew and were not walking with him anymore. So Jesus said to the 12, You do not want to go away also, do you? Simon Peter answered him, Lord, to whom shall we go? You have words of eternal life. We have believed and have come to know that you are the Holy One of God. Jesus answered them, Did I myself not choose you, the 12, and yet one of you is a devil? And he meant Judas, the son of Simon Iscariot, for he, one of the 12, was going to betray him. And so we see that he loses many disciples. The 12 don't leave, though Judas will leave later. But many of them wanted the food, but they didn't want the teaching. And so when he gives them some hard teaching, suddenly they abandon him. So how does this apply to us today? Well, first, we see that Jesus and his disciples could have used time to rest. The 12 had just returned from travels and preaching, and John the Baptist had been executed, all of which could have been emotionally draining. And it's important sometimes for us to try to find times to rest and recharge, times to grieve, times to go over new experiences and see what can be learned from them. These times can be very important for us. And it's important to make sure that we do have enough rest and recovery times. In this case, Jesus took them to a place more remote. Sometimes it's good to take some sort of retreat, to pull away from where we normally are in order to get the rest and recovery we need. If we stay where we are, then even if we are looking to rest, we may find it harder to do so. It's so much easier for the normal routines and interactions to get in the way. They pulled off to some remote place in order to try and get more rest because crowds were always around him. And yet when they get there, they are met with a crowd. This crowd may not have known about John the Baptist or the travels of the 12. They may not have cared if they did know. They may not have known why John the Baptist's death might be significant to these disciples and to Jesus. They saw Jesus and they knew that he could do things for them. And we see that Jesus had compassion on them. He cared about them, and when they came to him, even though he was tired, he still helped them. He stayed with them throughout the day and taught them. What about us? When we are tired, are we less likely to help people or to make excuses? Surely, if people knew we had just experienced something difficult and we needed some downtime, most people wouldn't begrudge us, right? But even when we're tired, we should still have compassion. If there's really a need, we should want to help meet it. And this is especially true of spiritual needs. What if somebody wants to talk about Jesus and what it means to be a Christian that hasn't wanted to talk before? If we brush them off because we are tired, maybe we never get another chance to talk to them. While we may think that people would understand if they knew the things that we are going through, and we wish that they would consider our feelings, when we think that, we are often not thinking about trying to understand what they are going through or considering their feelings. We want them to think about our feelings sometimes so we don't have to think about their feelings. Both of us may be going through difficult times. And we can minister to them, and we need to have compassion and be motivated to minister to them, even when we're tired ourselves. It's important for us to try and get rest. It's even more important to meet the spiritual needs of those who are like sheep without a shepherd. And we see the apostles don't seem to object at first, but as it gets late, they realize there's a problem. They're in a remote area. Now people are going to be hungry. It's going to be hard to feed them, especially with the size of the crowd. 5,000 men, along with women and children. They're almost certainly close to 10,000 people, and likely 15,000 or more. It would be hard to feed 150 people in a remote region, much less 15,000. So the apostles suggest that Jesus needs to send them away so that they can find food. They say so that they can go to the surrounding villages. No single village could feed that many people. They needed to disperse to multiple places to find that much food. It isn't necessarily that the apostles lack compassion. They felt compassion. They recognized that these people are going to need food. And they feel sorry for them. And they're like, you need to send them so that they can have food. But they also figured, the apostles also figured that it was a problem outside of their control. When Jesus says for them to feed them, they reply that 200 denarii wouldn't be enough to feed the crowd even a little bit. Imagine today if we dealt with something like that. If we were asked to suddenly feed 15,000 people, how much would that cost? If you say $5 a person, you're looking at $75,000. That's well over the average income for a year. And that's a fairly cheap price for everyone to eat until they're satisfied. We can understand the apostles' surprise when Jesus says they should feed them. But Jesus tells them to see what they have. And they find 5 loaves and 2 fish. John tells us that Andrew found a boy that had that and offered it. They are skeptical, but the boy seems willing to help. Jesus takes that, and it turns out to be enough to feed everybody. How does that apply to us, though? It's not like we can miraculously make more food or do something like that. Well, it can be easy to look at the state of the world, at the state of America, at the state of many churches, and see a problem too big for us to fix. It's easy to say that if people had acted sooner and stronger to resist the subverting of morality and biblical teaching, that we wouldn't be in such a predicament now. And the fact is, that's true. If people in America stood up for morality more, we wouldn't have gotten into this slide. If churches had taken stronger stands on biblical teaching and said it doesn't matter what the world says and what our culture says, we're going to teach the Bible and not be ashamed of it. And we're going to teach it and make sure everyone knows what we believe in and why we believe it, we wouldn't be in such a predicament now. It's harder now than it was. But that doesn't mean there's nothing that can be done now. We need to be like the boy and offer what we have to Jesus, rather than the apostles that say, but what is so little for so great a problem? Jesus can take the little we have that we offer to him and multiply it to have a much greater and much farther reaching effect than we could have ever imagined. If we say churches should have stood up stronger for morality in the past, we stand up stronger for morality now. If we say churches shouldn't have conformed to the culture, we say we will not conform to the culture. And while we may only be one church and only some people, if we start living according to the Bible, people will take notice and it can catch on. And God can multiply it and continue to multiply it and spiritually feed thousands of people, starting with only a few of us. And it can grow even further. It started with 12 apostles, with 120 people in Acts 2, and spread throughout the world and turned the world upside down. We need to be like the boy and say, this is what I have, Lord. You can use it for your purposes. And we'll be amazed at the result. We also see Jesus sends the disciples on ahead, probably partially to keep them from being involved in the situation that he knew was coming. And he dismisses the crowd. We'll return to the crowd later, but we'll look at the disciples for now. As Jesus walks on water, they see him and think he is a ghost at first. They become frightened. But Jesus seeks to calm them down. When they realize it is Jesus, they invite him into the boat, and the weather calms down. Interestingly, even though Mark is often thought to provide some of Peter's perspective, it doesn't mention the fact that Peter walked on the water too. It doesn't mention that he got out of the boat and walked towards Jesus. And it doesn't mention that he faltered, but Jesus caught him. Instead, though, Mark has a very sober statement. It says they had not gained any insight from the incident of the loaves, but their heart was hardened. They still had such little faith. And when Jesus catches Peter, he says, "O ye of little faith." Even after seeing such great miracles, and even though this was the second time that he had calmed a storm, they still have such weak faith. And maybe sometimes we fail to learn the lessons God is trying to teach us. Maybe even if we're around Scripture regularly and at church regularly, we still miss certain things because our heart is hardened. Maybe we still let fear control us. The disciples are often quite afraid, and then Jesus calms everything down. And then they go back to being afraid the next time. Do we do that too? Do we, whenever we feel like we have lost control, start to panic? Do we let fear run our lives? Do you imagine the worst case scenarios to be the most likely scenarios? Do we listen to others that make us more afraid and become echo chambers of fear? Have we had instances where we were afraid, but then something happened and we realized that Jesus had provided us peace and relief? Do we learn from that? Or do we go right back to being afraid the next time we feel things are slipping out of our control? Are our hearts hardened, or do we learn to trust him more and realize that we were never in control in the first place, but also realize that he has never not been in control? Do we take courage and not fear? We can also learn some lessons from the crowd. The crowd has just seen a miracle beyond anything they could have anticipated. Jesus took just a little food and easily fed everybody with plenty left over as a result. The people were still looking for a Messiah that would be a physical king, and they figured that this was proof that Jesus was what they needed. By now, Jesus had healed the sick, including diseases like leprosy and a woman's 12-year-long hemorrhage that nobody else could cure. Jesus had even raised the dead. And Jesus can produce food. This is perfect for a king leading an army against the Romans. If soldiers die, Jesus can revive them. If they find themselves in a siege, Jesus can continually supply food and cure any diseases that might creep up. If they're going on a long march, they don't have to pack extra food with them, as he can continually supply it on their journey. The people had longed for somebody to overthrow the Romans, and Jesus was their perfect candidate, so they wanted to make him king by force. But Jesus knew this, and instead of going along with it, he retreated to spend time in prayer, and then he walked across the sea to avoid them. They probably figured that with the apostles already gone, that Jesus couldn't get away from them if they were surrounding him on all sides other than the sea. Well, how does this apply to us today? Well, when we let God work in our lives, people might often take notice. They might then try to build us up into something else. It can be easy to let the adoration and appreciation of a crowd lead us astray, or to start thinking that it's all about us instead of God working through us. We can get a big head, a big ego. They might not mean to lead us astray, and they might think that they're doing us a favor as they seek to publicize us, but they don't fully understand. It's important for us to always be in communication with God and to be seeking to follow him and seeking to stay in line with his will, rather than getting caught up in the sea of popularity. What about another aspect, though? We know that God is powerful, and sometimes we think that that means that he should do what we want. We have our own ideas of what God should or shouldn't do, and we want him to fit our version of him, rather than who he really is. I've known many people, some of whom I've known for most or all of our lives, that grew up in the church. They know God exists. They know Jesus is the Son of God and that he is God. They know that there's a heaven, and they know that there's a hell. They want to go to heaven, but they have convinced themselves that they can force Jesus to be who they want him to be. Like the crowd, they want to receive the miraculous blessings that Jesus provides, but on their terms. For the crowd, that was physical food and healings. For many today, it is about heaven and salvation. But Jesus doesn't submit to our terms. If we try and force him to our will, we will find that we lost him. And we won't even realize it happened until much later. Sometimes not until death, unfortunately. When they catch up with him, they ask him where he went. And he starts teaching them again. He teaches them about the spiritual food he really wants to provide. That eating physical food, even if miraculous, won't keep us from dying. But that eating spiritual food is what gives us eternal life. Sadly, John says that as a result of these difficult teachings, that many left Jesus and no longer followed him. When confronted with having to choose to follow him on his terms or leave him entirely, they chose to abandon him. And many today have made the same choice. When they have to choose between following Jesus on his terms, including when those go against society and the new morality that society has forged, they abandon his words entirely. Some may still claim to follow him, but Jesus tells us that not everybody that says to him, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only those who do the will of his Father, only those that submit to Scripture. Ultimately, are we just looking for what Jesus can do for us? Or are we willing to submit to him and his words? The Bible tells us what is right and what is wrong. It tells us how to be saved. It tells us how to live out our faith so that it doesn't become dead. Because it warns us that a dead faith can't save us. It warns us not to conform to the pattern of this world, but to be transformed by the renewing of our minds. Will we interpret culture according to the Bible, or the Bible according to culture? Following culture leads to hell. Following the Bible leads to heaven. Let us echo Peter's words that we won't go anywhere because only Jesus has the words of life. That we have believed and have come to know that Jesus is the Holy One of God. If you're not a Christian and you want to receive those words of life, if you want to become a Christian, or if you are a Christian but you find yourself trying to make Jesus obey your will instead of submitting to his will, then contact me and we'll talk or find the time to meet and talk about what it means to be a Christian.